Okay, so this is the first meeting of the International Machiavelli Society. The society has two official languages for obvious reasons, English and Italian. So I will say the first things in English, and then when I talk about Professor Sasso, who will receive the first award of the society, I will speak in Italian. So the society has been founded by me and some other colleagues, Sean Irwin, Ioannis Evrigenis, Gabriele Pedulla, Vicky Sullivan. And the idea is to put together the different communities that study Machiavelli all over the world. You know, there are different, especially different points of view on which Machiavelli studied, and people frequently don't talk much with each other, people belonging to the different communities. We want to have this dialogue between different, across different fields. Well, one thing, I repeat what I already said, if at the end, whatever people, when people have issues or concerns, they should use the button called at the bottom right, called Q&A or DNA for asking questions. And now you also, a couple of more points about the society. As you know, it's possible to enroll in it now. And if people, now I put the email that everyone can write to in case they haven't received informations about this meeting. This means that you are not in the mailing list for some reason, or perhaps the address you have used given us is wrong. So I'll put it in the question and answers the right. I don't know if I can put it. Can I put it in the chat, Andrew? Anyway,
you could put it in the Q&A as an answered question.
Can you put it? Because it doesn't seem that I can.
Okay,
so
hang on.
I put it in the chat. Okay, so there is an email address you can use if you want to enroll in the society. And the last thing I want to, a couple of things I want to mention. On May 12th, same time, there will be another lecture by Professor Ellison Brown. And next year, we don't know yet when, in Roma, at the University Roma 3, Università Roma 3, there will be the first conference, but we want really to do the first conference physically present. So will be next year at some point. Soon we'll say when. Now, we also wanted to start with a prize to recognize the achievements of very important Machiavelli scholar. And this is Gennaro Sasso, Professor Gennaro Sasso, and now I will turn to Italian. So, Gennaro Sasso è, ovviamente tutti sanno chi è Gennaro Sasso, chi è qua. E comincerò da un fatto che secondo me è un apax nell'Accademia Mondiale. Ossia, nonostante il fatto che Gennaro Sasso sia un'autorità mondiale su Machiavelli, non ha mai fatto un corso su Machiavelli, almeno per quanto ne so io. Cioè, si è occupato di altro. Cioè, era come dire un hobby intellettuale, perché appunto non ha mai fatto un corso su questo autore. E ha fatto corsi, come sapete, la tradizione idealistica italiana, su autori, da Spinoza, Croce, e si è occupato di Hegel, e si è occupato soprattutto di filosofia teoretica negli ultimi anni, però mai corsi su Machiavelli. Eppure su Machiavelli il professor Sasso ha prodotto una quantità di studi fondamentali. È stato anche ideatore dell'enciclopedia machiavelliana, che è un'opera meritoria, come ognuno sa. Ha scritto 2 volumi di biografia intellettuale di Machiavelli, in uno in particolare, nel secondo, ha sottolineato sulla storiografia machiavelliana, ha sottolineato l'enorme rilevanza delle storie fiorentine, che sino a tempi recenti erano state piuttosto ignorate dal dibattito, e invece ne ha mostrato la grandissima importanza nel raffronto che vi viene sviluppato soprattutto tra la storia della Repubblica Romana e quella della Repubblica Fiorentina. Poi ha sviluppato molti altri anche volumi su Machiavelli, in particolare 4 volumi di studi su Machiavelli e gli antichi, con moltissimi temi di grande rilevanza che hanno innovato il dibattito. In generale, la curvatura che il professor Sasso ha dato alla sua interpretazione machiavelliana è quella di un dissidio tragico nel pensiero di Niccolò tra l'etica e la ragione politica, e quindi appunto una sorta di autore che ci mette a disagio, dice il professore, e porta come esempio un detto che in qualche modo rappresenta il Machiavelli più controverso, ma anche il più profondo: non semper pacta sunt servanda, cioè che è ovviamente il rovesciamento di una tradizione legata sia alla tradizione religiosa sia anche al giusnaturalismo, e Machiavelli lo sovverte perché appunto le esigenze della politica non sempre coincidono con quelle della morale. E sullo sfondo c'è anche un'antropologia rivoluzionaria che appunto, secondo me, ne fa il precursore della filosofia moderna, in sostanza. E gli studi del professor Sasso hanno insistito su alcuni aspetti fondamentali moltissimi aspetti fondamentali della vita intellettuale e anche della vita vera e propria di Machiavelli. Ho sentito una sua lecture online in cui dice che un aspetto che ancora andrebbe approfondito è evidentemente quello della giovinezza di Machiavelli, prima che entrasse nella cancelleria, prima che perlomeno diventasse segretario della seconda cancelleria. Quello è un periodo un po' misterioso, in effetti. Però sul periodo meno misterioso il professore ha dato studi fondamentali. Per esempio ha scritto molto, in maniera decisiva, cruciale, sui rapporti tra Machiavelli e Lucrezio, Machiavelli e Polibio, sottolineando la differenza tra le due concezioni metastoriche di questi autori, che pure si somigliano ovviamente molto. E poi Machiavelli e Dante è un altro degli eroi del professor Sasso, se non sbaglio ha scritto 8 libri su Dante. E Machiavelli e Borgia, d'accordo? Cosa significa per Machiavelli il caso di Cesare Borgia. E poi altri studi decisivi sono stati quelli sul celeberrimo 5° capitolo del secondo libro dei Discorsi, la discussione implicita sull'eternità del mondo che il professor Sasso ha svolto in modo tale che l'adesione di Machiavelli al paradigma eternista non si può ormai più dubitare. E in generale il professore ha sottolineato questo riassunto, ho trovato la sua interpretazione di Machiavelli come una sorta di repubblicanesimo non moraleggiante, quindi differente dal repubblicanesimo nelle espressioni più contemporanee, giocato sostanzialmente su 2 grandi tematiche: la decadenza e il conflitto. La decadenza a cui naturalmente la virtù può cercare di porre argine, e il conflitto che è ineliminabile dalla vita politica, e anzi la Costituzione repubblicana dovrebbe auspicabilmente incanalare nei canali istituzionali. Dunque, questo è solo un brevissimo accenno sull'enorme contributo del professor Sasso agli studi su Machiavelli, e nel appunto attribuirgli il primo premio alla carriera della International Machiavelli Society, aggiungo che gli spediremo appena possibile questa lettera, che è un manoscritto rinascimentale della famiglia Machiavelli, ramo principale, del 1531, in cui si parla di una dote. Allora stavamo cercando di capire, essendo il ramo principale, di chi potesse essere questa dote, e questo è solo 4 anni dopo la morte di Machiavelli. Quindi, professore, gliela spedisco e lei poi ci dice di che cosa si tratta, perché appunto si discute in dettaglio la dote di questa signorina che sta per andare a matrimonio, appunto della famiglia principale di Machiavelli. Gliela consegnerò, gliela spedirò non appena possibile. Allora, professore, con le mie più fervide congratulazioni e complimenti, le lascio la parola per un suo intervento.
Innanzitutto grazie, sono state dette cose così gentili e così affettuose nei miei riguardi che sono così un po' turbato, perché ho l'impressione che, non lo dico per falsa modestia, che tutti questi riconoscimenti in fondo dovrebbero essere poi controllati sulla, come dire, pagina viva, è vero, di Machiavelli, che non è un autore che consenta, è vero, di riposare a lungo su interpretazioni che si siano date del suo pensiero, perché ha dentro di sé un'inquietudine costante che lo rende, per così dire, un tormento, è vero, per quelli che seriamente si avvicinano a lui per capire, per approfondire, per entrare insomma nel vivo, è vero, di questa mente che ha, sì, certo, studiato profondamente la politica, l'ha osservata nelle sue dimensioni anche tragiche, ma per uno studioso italiano di Machiavelli questo vale in modo preminente, e sempre più, direi, questa dimensione sta prendendo corpo, sta diventando importante, per esempio dentro di me, ed è il modo in cui Machiavelli ha per tutta la vita sofferto, è vero, il problema dell'Italia, che naturalmente non era per lui l'Italia così com'è adesso, cioè una nazione mita, era tante realtà regionali in conflitto, ma era però caratterizzata unitariamente, a suo parere, da una tendenza alla decadenza e a far morire, è vero, le cose che profondamente preoccupava un personaggio come lui, che senza avere nessuna delle caratteristiche che poi saranno tipiche dei nazionalismi dei secoli successivi, aveva però tuttavia il senso di questo paese che rischiava continuamente di andare in pezzi. E direi che questo problema, che in Machiavelli è così vivo e così drammatico e che gli detta, è vero, delle pagine veramente indimenticabili, non dovrebbe mai essere dimenticato da uno studioso italiano, di Machiavelli, perché ancora adesso, insomma, e forse adesso in questo particolare momento, in modo così drammatico, si sente, è vero, che qualche cosa sta veramente, spero non crollando, ma minacciando, è vero, seriamente, di non reggere più se stesso. Devo anche dire che, come è stato detto, io effettivamente non ho mai dedicato un corso a Machiavelli, ma in genere non ho mai dedicato corsi durante gli anni del mio insegnamento universitario ad autori che stessi studiando, è vero, a casa mia. C'è sempre stata una dissociazione tra quello che io ero la mattina quando studiavo a casa mia o in biblioteca e quello che ero nel pomeriggio quando facevo lezione all'università. Perché questo sia avvenuto poi non lo so, ma perché ritenevo poi tutto sommato che sarebbe stato più libera la mia qualsiasi trattazione degli autori che spiegavo a lezione, se non fossi stato, per così dire, condizionato da altre passioni, altri interessi che nello studio privato, è vero, talvolta accadono. E così c'è stata questa dicotomia, questa dissociazione tra il me che studiava a casa e il me che insegnava all'università. Ma c'è però qualche cosa di più che io adesso dovrei dire, e cioè che i miei studi machiavelliani sono terminati, adesso non saprei dire l'anno esatto, ma sono terminati da almeno 20 anni, perché dopo avere rischiato, è vero, di essere come dire, lo studioso di un solo autore, ho poi messo da parte questo autore ingombrante e affascinante e mi sono dedicato ad altri interessi che pure erano in me, e così ho, insomma, coltivato alcuni altri rami, per così dire, della riflessione storiografica e filosofica. Quindi sono anche un machiavellista in disarmo da questo punto di vista. Ho cercato di seguire, è vero, la il progredire degli studi machiavelliani, dopo che io avevo abbandonato il campo, ho letto parecchi libri, ho visto che molte cose sono accadute, è vero che ai tempi in cui io studiavo Machiavelli non erano ancora presenti, molte cose importanti dalle quali ho appreso, dalle quali molti potranno apprendere, ma insomma, come dire, uno studioso attuale di Machiavelli non sono più, e quindi devo, sotto questo punto di vista, dichiarare, è vero, questa situazione che mi rende in qualche modo in parte attuale e in parte non attuale alla machiavellistica, è vero, di oggi. La machiavellistica di oggi ha prodotto cose importanti e vorrei dire che tutta la machiavellistica si è trasformata profondamente da quando io cominciai a occuparmi di Machiavelli, che quando io ero in secondo liceo, si era nell'anno di grazia 1944-1945, di cui si può calcolare, vero, gli anni che mi stanno sulle spalle, che sono tantissimi. Ecco, insomma, io lessi Il Principe e mi fui folgorato, anche se credo di avere capito forse la 10ª parte di quello che stava scritto in quel libro così concentrato e così difficile. Ma allora però veramente, è vero, uscendo fuori dalle aule del liceo, andando nelle biblioteche, cercando di radunare la letteratura machiavelliana allora esistente, il panorama, è vero, in Italia, ma anche in Francia, ma anche in Germania, era tutto sommato, per quanto riguardava questo grande autore, abbastanza povero. Ecco, non c'è il minimo confronto, è vero, tra la machiavellistica, è vero, di quegli anni, è vero, diciamo dei tardi anni 40, primi anni 50, e la machiavellistica di oggi, che ha titoli, è vero, notevoli e molteplici. Ecco. E mi trovai certamente in grande difficoltà. E devo dire adesso, dicendo in modo molto rapido e molto schematico, che quando progredì un po', è vero, nella conoscenza e nello studio di Machiavelli, mi trovai, è vero, nella necessità di affrontare Machiavelli dal punto di vista dei temi, di alcuni temi che emergevano dal suo pensiero. Per esempio, è evidente che nel pensiero di Machiavelli dal pensiero di Machiavelli viene fuori in modo preminente il tema della virtù e della fortuna, ma soprattutto il tema della fortuna, cioè di questo intreccio complesso e non dominabile fino in fondo delle cose, da cui poi deriva la salute o la rovina degli stati. Questo era un tema che avrebbe potuto essere studiato in sé, estratto, per così dire, fuori dal contesto vivo dell'opera di Machiavelli. L'altro tema naturalmente era quello classico, in Italia particolarmente dibattuto, è vero, negli anni, nei tardi anni 40 e nei primi anni 50, che era quello del rapporto tra la politica e la morale. Allora c'erano due sistemi filosofici che erano ancora dominanti, è vero, in Italia, quello di Croce e quello di Gentile, divergenti su questo punto, e questa divergenza si rifletteva nelle interpretazioni degli studiosi che, a seconda che pendessero più dalla parte di Croce o da quella di Gentile, davano rilievo alla drammaticità, è vero, del conflitto tra queste due potenze, o invece l'accordo di queste due potenze, che naturalmente poi avveniva nell'ambito degli studiosi gentiliani, è vero, nel segno di una etica che era però, per così dire, tutta piena, è vero, di politica e di durezza statuale. Questo mio modo, è vero, di studiare Machiavelli entrò in crisi quando io ebbi la fortuna, come studente universitario, di conoscere Federico Chabot. Federico Chabot è l'autore di un libro, di un piccolo libro, che uscì nel 1925 e che era la rielaborazione della sua tesi di laurea avvenuta a Torino nel 1923-1924, un piccolo libro che poi è stato in qualche modo reso inattuale dallo stesso autore, che non ha più ripreso il tema di fondo di quel libro e ha orientato diversamente gli studi machiavelliani. Ma quel libro, che era stato scritto non senza ricevere delle sollecitazioni dalla Torino gobettiana, è vero, degli anni in cui Chabot la frequentava, Chabot era nato ad Aosta, ma allora Aosta era Piemonte, adesso non lo è più, però aveva studiato a Torino, non senza ricevere, dicevo, influenze dal modo gobettiano di intendere la poesia italiana. Aveva scritto questo libro molto bello, molto forte dal punto di vista della interpretazione storica, un po' meno forte, diciamo, nell'interpretazione del testo di Machiavelli, per sostenere la tesi, una tesi che aveva anche delle venature orianesche, tutto sommato, della inattualità del principe di Machiavelli, nel momento in cui il principato, la signoria stava entrando in crisi e si stavano affermando piuttosto delle formazioni statuali più ampie di quelle che non fossero quello dello Stato-città. Questa tesi, che Chabot non ha più ripreso, conteneva però dentro di sé un principio metodologico importante, cioè suggeriva che non si dovessero cercare i temi, no, i leitmotiv del pensiero di Machiavelli isolandoli e studiandoli ad una ad una, ma si dovesse cercare di avere sempre davanti agli occhi la totalità machiavelliana da ricostruire storicamente nelle sue differenze, nelle sue coincidenze, nelle sue dissonanze. E questo è stato poi quello, è vero, che dopo essere stato in contatto molto a lungo, è vero, con Chabot, ed avere quindi con lui, attraverso la sua parola e attraverso le discussioni che talvolta accaddero tra lui e me, è vero, su questo punto avvenne che io riuscissi a maturare quella, diciamo, prospettiva storicizzante, che non significava, vero, che il pensiero venisse eluso e che i suoi problemi non venissero affrontati, ma significava, vero, che la disposizione diacronica piuttosto che sincronica della trattazione, è vero, tenesse conto appunto anche delle differenze che di volta in volta poi potevano accadere, talvolta all'interno della stessa opera, più spesso naturalmente tra opera e opera, e quindi per esempio il problema del rapporto, temi classici della storiografia machiavelliana, tra il principe e i discorsi. Detto questo, e per non intrattenere troppo a lungo i presenti che attendono una conferenza ben altrimenti importante di quello che io adesso sto dicendo, una riflessione su quello che vorrei, è vero, che mi accadesse, magari per miracolo, prima di prendere la via dell'aldilà. C'è una curiosità fortissima dentro di me, ma credo che sia comune a tutti gli studiosi di Machiavelli, una curiosità fortissima che deriva dal fatto, è vero, che la vita intellettuale di Machiavelli, la vita di Machiavelli come è nota a noi, incomincia quando questo personaggio è sui 28-29 anni e sta per entrare nella cancelleria fiorentina, ma non come si credeva una volta, come un semplice impiegato della cancelleria, ma con un titolo importante, e cioè come il capo della seconda cancelleria. Le cancellerie a Firenze erano due, c'era una cancelleria che possiamo dire umanistica, il cancelliere che la dirigeva era Verti, un umanista, ed era un personaggio che quindi scriveva in latino, è vero, ciò che accadeva nella prassi di questa cancelleria, e poi c'era la cancelleria politica, la seconda cancelleria, che presiedeva essenzialmente alla politica estera. Ora, che cosa aveva? Questa è la curiosità che credo sia comune a tutti i machiavellisti o anche i semplici lettori di Machiavelli. Ma che cosa aveva fatto Machiavelli negli anni precedenti? Perché non sono pochi 28 o 29 anni per un personaggio di quel genere, con quell'ingegno, con quella curiosità, con quello spirito di iniziativa, non saranno certamente stati anni inerti. Sappiamo che Machiavelli era figlio di oggi si direbbe un avvocato, un uomo di legge. Messer Bernardo era un uomo che studiava il diritto, nella casa di Machiavelli c'erano libri di diritto, sappiamo anche che Machiavelli non è mai diventato un giurista, ha trattato il diritto sempre in modo piuttosto laterale, non ha mancato nella Mandragola di farne oggetto di satira anche piuttosto pungente, e non sappiamo però nulla, è vero, di quello che Machiavelli realmente facesse nella sua giovinezza, salvo, è vero, che è lui, certamente è lui, è vero, il trascrittore totale del De Rerum Natura di Lucrezia. C'è un bellissimo codice alla Biblioteca Vaticana che si può leggere, tra l'altro scritto anche in maniera molto leggibile, ed è tutto il poema di Lucrezio, è vero, trascritto, è vero, da Niccolò Machiavelli, il quale quindi era un personaggio che possedeva la lingua latina, non come qualcuno ha detto recentemente male, ma molto bene, perché certamente non si trascrive Lucrezio se non si sa il latino per bene. Che altro aveva letto? Che altro aveva studiato in questo periodo? La frase famosa della lettera ai lettori in cui si parla del principe, che Machiavelli ha scritto nel primissimo tempo del suo, chiamiamolo, esilio a Sant'Andrea in Percussina, parla della lezione delle cose moderne e della continua lezione delle antiche. Ora, la continua lezione dell'antica significa la reiterata lettura di testi classici. Poniamo per esempio Tito Livio, ma non evidentemente soltanto Tito Livio. Ma quando comincia questa lettura? Evidentemente comincia negli anni giovanili, perché non è certamente pensabile che Machiavelli abbia, diciamo, costruito la sua dottrina di storico romano, diremmo oggi essenzialmente di storico romano, quando era impegnato dalla mattina alla sera nel massacrante lavoro di segretario della seconda cancelleria, che implicava una continua presenza nella città di Firenze e una continua assenza dalla città di Firenze in giro per le corti italiane e europee. Machiavelli è stato 4 volte alla corte di Francia, è stato poi alla corte di Massimiliano e così via dicendo. Quindi un personaggio molto impegnato nella prassi, che certamente non poteva dedicare altrettanta attenzione alla politica. Ma allora il dubbio che più volte mi è venuto: ma se Machiavelli a partire dal 1513 ha scritto Il Principe, poi ha dato mano ai discorsi, poi si è occupato del problema della milizia e ha elaborato altrettanti testi su queste materie in un numero di anni relativamente scarso, ma non sarà forse possibile, non sarebbe possibile, se avessimo i documenti, ritenere che molta della scienza politica di Machiavelli, anziché derivare dalla prassi da lui esercitata come, per esempio, legato, ambasciatore, diciamo, della Repubblica Fiorentina, o come un personaggio impegnato a risolvere problemi della milizia e della politica fiorentina nella città, non è possibile pensare che i principi fondamentali di questa scienza, elaborati leggendo i classici, non si siano formati prima che Machiavelli, prima del famoso 1513-14, a mio modo di vedere, che è l'anno del principe, prima dell'anno probabilmente 1514-1515, in cui verosimilmente ha cominciato a comporre il primo libro dei discorsi. Non è possibile retrodatare quest'opera ad anni precedenti. Questa è la curiosità, perché certo diventerebbe diverso il discorso, e quello che a me capitò di fare quando cercai di rimediare all'assenza di documenti relativi alla giovinezza di Machiavelli, cercando la formazione politica di Machiavelli nelle legazioni, cioè nelle lettere che egli scriveva dalle corti presso le quali andava, è vero, come legato o come ambasciatore. Questo modo di impostare la questione potrebbe modificarsi in modo rilevante se possedessimo un Machiavelli che viene prima del Machiavelli noto. Questo sarebbe effettivamente il desiderio se non avessi l'età che ho e non ci fosse la pandemia e tutti i guai, è vero, che rendono difficile la vita agli studiosi qui in Italia, qui in Europa, ma non soltanto in Europa purtroppo, ecco, io riprenderei l'abitudine che avevo da giovane, me ne andrei una volta ogni fine settimana a Firenze, cercherei nelle biblioteche fiorentine un po' a caso, come si fa quando si cerca qualcosa che non si sa dove sia, e chissà, potrebbe accadermi una volta di trovare una lettera, un documento, qualche cosa che mi facesse intravedere le linee della giovinezza di Machiavelli, che deve essere stata una giovinezza piena di cose, contrariamente a quello che noi siamo costretti a pensare, perché la vediamo vuota, piena di cose, perché un uomo così certamente non sarà stato, è vero, con le mani in mano, è vero, nel periodo della sua formazione, e c'è a mio modo di vedere, c'è un indizio nell'opera di Machiavelli, e cioè nel primo capitolo dell'Asino, la storia di questo strano ragazzo che aveva contratto una malattia incurabile. Questa malattia, come si sa, era stranissima. Questo ragazzo non poteva star fermo, correva, non aveva modo. Il padre lo aveva condotto dai più importanti medici, lo aveva sottoposto a pratiche magiche, non c'era stato niente da fare. Appena metteva piedi sul terreno cominciava a correre, il che significava probabilmente che il giovane Machiavelli, che il suo segretario, il suo coadiutore in cancelleria, Agostino Vespucci Agostino Vespucci, a un certo punto definisce cursitandi avidus, cioè insomma che non poteva star fermo. Ecco, questo personaggio probabilmente è allegorizzato da Machiavelli in quel ragazzo incurabile che correva sempre, cioè che passava da un'esperienza ad un'altra, che era voracemente orientato a conquistare evidentemente sapere, esperienze, e chissà che proprio in quegli anni dell'avida corsa di Machiavelli non siano state delineate, fissate le prime linee di quel pensiero che poi egli mise alla prova quando fece politica e che poi dette luogo alle opere scritte posteres perditas. Certo, non bisogna dimenticare la prima delegazione alla Corte di Francia. Machiavelli è, insomma, sì, certo, segretario della seconda cancelleria, ma è giovane, è di fronte a Georges d'Amboise, dal cardinale di Rouen, un personaggio potente, quello che gli italiani chiamavano Roano, ecco, e gli dice a un certo punto, così, come se niente fosse, che i francesi non si intendevano dello Stato, perché se si fossero intesi dello Stato non avrebbero fatto quello che avevano fatto in Italia con la politica di Luigi XII. Uno che parla così ha alle spalle qualche cosa che non può essere semplicemente la poca esperienza conseguita nei pochi mesi che aveva vissuto da che era entrato in cancelleria. Ecco, mi piacerebbe avere questa fortuna, non avrò certamente questa fortuna, forse non esiste un documento che ci spieghi cosa avesse fatto Machiavelli prima di entrare in cancelleria, e questo rimarrà un problema per la storiografia machiavelliana, ma io naturalmente sarei felicissimo se uno studioso di Machiavelli domani, sia giovane sia vecchio, ma comunque uno studioso di Machiavelli, andando in qualche biblioteca, trovasse il libro rivelatore di questo mestiere. Avremo un Machiavelli più pieno, più corposo, e forse avremo di che divertirci. Non io certamente, ma i machiavellisti di oggi, i giovani machiavellisti di oggi e di domani, ai quali naturalmente, come abbastanza vecchio ormai del mestiere, rivolgo gli auguri più affettuosi, così come rivolgo i ringraziamenti più vivi alla Machiavellian Society, che mi onora, è vero, di questo riconoscimento. Grazie.
Grazie a lei, professore, di questo bellissimo discorso. Siamo grati e ci ha dato molti spunti di pensiero. Allora la salutiamo, le farò avere la famosa lettera Grazie tante. E
Grazie
allora
a voi.
passo la parola a Ioannis Grigonis. Ioannis, your turn. Non so bene.
Thank you very much. I want to begin with some quick thanks. First of all, I want to thank Andrew Alcuesta for organizing the webinar. And I also want to thank Sean Irwin, without whose leadership we wouldn't have gotten our act together. So thank you, Sean. And last but not least, I want to thank Professor Mansfield for kicking us off. I have the pleasure and good fortune of having to introduce somebody who doesn't need an introduction in this group. So I will keep it brief. So Professor Mansfield is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard. He's a preeminent scholar of Machiavelli. He has written books on Machiavelli, including Machiavelli's New Modes and Orders and Machiavelli's Virtue. But I think our first debt to him is for his translations and editions of Machiavelli, including The Prince, the Discourses on Livy, the Florentine Histories, and also for his other studies on Machiavelli. Right now, I stand between you and the effectual truth, so I will hand it off to Professor Mansfield. Thank you.
Sorry, 1 second. And can we switch the screen from Professor Sasso now, Andrew?
It should be on Professor Mansfield right now.
So, full screen, is it possible?
It should be a full screen on Professor Mansfield right now.
Okay. I don't know, so only 1 second. Professor Sasso, lei vuole che tenere lo schermo acceso o preferisce che lo leviamo?
No, va benissimo, va bene.
Okay,
Grazie.
please, sorry for the interruption. Harvey.
Again, I would like to add my voice to the congratulations to Gennaro Sasso. He and I don't work on the same side of the street, but we work in the same neighborhood. And I believe that he is the capo of the Machiavelli world. Capo is the effectual truth of the finer compliments that you heard before. And as you will hear me shortly say, that the Machiavelli world is the world of modernity. This new organization, I think, has two goals. The first is to bring together the Anglophones and the Italians who've lived too much apart. And the second is to bring together 2 points of view. This is a separate distinction, namely the point of view of philology, also literary, versus the point of view of philosophy. So my subject today is Machiavelli's effectual truth. And I will start from the philology of a new phrase and move quickly to the philosophy that it introduces. Machiavelli's effectual truth, verità effettuale, appears in the first paragraph of chapter 15 of The Prince. There it is contrasted with the rival understanding of truth, quote, the effectual truth of the thing rather than the imagination of it. It is usually taken to announce the realism for which Machiavelli is reasonably given credit, the realism of modern science, modern philosophy, and modern politics that thrived in the West until it was confronted by the modern idealism of Rousseau and Kant. But this particular contrast, in which Machiavelli himself confronts his effectual truth with the imaginative truth he regards as dominant in his time, is hardly ever studied. His pregnant words are left unborn or unproductive. The Italian effettuale is usually translated in English as effective, which means having the potential for an effect rather than actually having made one. Above all, the novelty of the word has not been noticed, and the signal it sends to all and sundry is left unobserved, even though its message to readers, particularly scholarly readers in our time, seems clear, if not loud. For the fact is that this is the only time that Machiavelli, in all his writings, ever uses that word, effettuale, or that phrase, verità effettuale. Further, this is a word that he apparently invented, only to use it once. And still further, a phrase, verità effettuale, that does not occur in any writing of the Italian Renaissance. I have been unable to find any use of the effectual truth prior to Machiavelli as well. That Machiavelli says it just once, and in a place where it can hardly be missed by an attentive reader, is a sign of its importance, not a slip of the pen. That it has no source has deprived it of the attention of scholars, except for a couple. What it signifies is something newly formulated and as weighty as the founding of modernity by the philosopher Machiavelli. I assert these brave words, that modernity had a founding rather than an emergence, a founding by a philosopher, the philosopher being Machiavelli, who was a philosopher. I assert them because I cannot prove them. A proof of strict necessity is probably impossible. Even proper elaboration is beyond my capacity. But I propose these assertions and will offer evidence that cannot be ignored, even if it has not been completed. The difficulty of proof is at first greatly increased by Machiavelli's use of irony, which requires him to contradict himself deliberately and to say something different from, even the contrary of, what he says literally. In a letter, he once said literally that he was, quote, a doctor of the art of lying. Quote, for some time now, I have never said what I believe or never believed what I said. And if indeed I sometimes tell the truth, I hide it behind so many lies that it is hard to find. Readers of Machiavelli, to be worthy of their reading, should keep these words before them as they proceed. With practice, one learns to pick up his hints, laugh at them, and enjoy seeking the truth that is hard to find. But finding the truth requires the use of one's imagination, as we'll see, despite the doubt Machiavelli raises about that use. Effectual truth looks to the effect of one's action as opposed to the imagination of it. The imagination is in the good one imagines will result. That's the intent. Machiavelli speaks of the effectual truth of the thing and does not mention any intent behind the action in order to stress the effect as a thing by itself, rather than as the consequence of what one intends. The effect is thus a deed separated from its intent. Whether that intent is a human choice, like a virtue, a choice to do good, or a purpose attributed to nature, such as the notion that humans naturally intend to do good. Today, we would call this effect fact. Fact is a modern word, not found before Machiavelli, nor used by him, at least in our sense, but the notion of it was discovered by him. Effectual truth could also be called factual truth, as both fact and effect come from the Latin facere, to make or do. Fact is stubborn, and effect is often contrary to one's intent or wish. A prime example is in the virtue of liberality, featured in Aristotle's list of the moral virtues and discussed as a quality in chapter 16 of Machiavelli's Prince. If you try to be liberal or generous, Machiavelli shows, the effect will be the contrary, a reputation for stinginess. This is the stubborn, effectual consequence of actions undertaken with wishful intent. Machiavelli's effectual truth is opposed to the truth according to nature. Nature was the original discovery of the first philosopher, Thales, who discovered the distinction between things in themselves and things as they were agreed to by human beings, who might attribute their character to creation by the gods or by God. The former was nature, physis. The latter convention, nomos. The former physis was unchangeable, that to which humans had to adjust themselves, and the latter, nomos, changeable, consisting of those adjustments in custom and legislation. In establishing custom and making laws, humans had to act according to the nature of things if they wished to succeed. But the nature of a thing is its completion or perfection, what it is at its best. For when defining a thing, one includes everything that belongs to it and excludes what is accidental, perhaps the sacredness added to it by convention. Particularly when the distinction between nature and convention is applied to the virtues, the standard for action becomes one's intent to follow the nature of the particular virtue, such as liberality, which is imagined at its best. But Machiavelli objects that this truth of imagination will be prevented by the actual effects of the virtue, and that the virtue will have the effect not of its perfect nature, but of its imperfect reception, or how it is held, tenuto, as opposed to how it is according to its nature. Liberality according to its nature, as imagined perfect, would be received as virtuous and understood as intended, but it is actually or effectually received in stages. First as beneficial with surprise, then expected as routine, and last as vicious when denied, as in time it must be when the cost of practicing virtue is felt. Thus, it's the standard of according to nature, especially of the Socratic tradition that recommends virtue, must be dropped. To take the example Machiavelli must have had in mind, Plato's Republic, Socrates seeks justice as it is, quote, according to nature. This is the standard Machiavelli rejects. With Machiavelli, according to nature as the guide for human action or human behavior in classical philosophy is replaced. In the same paragraph as effectual truth, he says that since acting with a profession of good will bring you to ruin, it is necessary for the prince to learn to be able to be not good and to use this and not use it, quote, according to necessity. Necessity has the same double character as nature. Just as nature means both spontaneous, as in doing what comes naturally, and on the other hand, also deliberately by choice, quote, according to nature, so necessity means doing what is compelling and urgent, regardless of everything else. And it also means, quote, according to necessity, perhaps in the long run, by deliberate choice. Necessity pays no regard to the complete nature of a virtue that is distinct from accident or accidental circumstances. Virtue in its nature is critical of impediments, such as one's self-interest, that might, for instance, make one hesitate to give because liberality is costly. Quote, "You can afford to give," says virtue. Necessity overrides the distinction between nature and accident or chance in its sovereign insistence on urgency and the pressing demands of oneself. Virtue takes its chances with present circumstances, satisfied with what seems now to be enough. But necessity looks to future necessities that it must anticipate. Necessity judges by the extreme case that virtue thinks unlikely and will face when it must. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, says the Bible. But necessity wants a universal standard that will hold in every situation. It judges the normal by the extreme and thereby abolishes the normal. For the normal is the realm of moral virtue that humans believe they can afford. Thus, nature and accident are made one. Nature is denied its distinctiveness from chance, and chance is made the necessary accompaniment of nature. One must practice a liberality that is secure from exhaustion by its cost. How to do this? Arrange your liberality to be paid by others. The effectual truth leads away from nature with its correlative of chance to necessity, which is divided among the various necessities that can be calculated to curtail, diminish, or conquer the influence of chance. Nature is composed of natures and necessity of necessities. These are necessities of behavior, not of form or substance. Effectual truth yields efficient causes, productive of effects, and does not respect or need to respect distinctions of form or ends of action, the formal and final causes of Aristotle. Form is rarely or never perfect. End is often unachieved. Nature's power is clouded and dispersed by the unpredictable but somehow inevitable power of chance. By replacing nature with necessity, however, exactness can be achieved through the clarity of cause and effect, avoiding the disconcerting spectacle of nature surprised by chance. All this goes to show the power of Machiavelli's effectual truth. It opens to view Machiavelli's insight into the future he anticipates, more or less clearly, of modern science. Modern science is exact because it attends to behavior and disposes of natures. It focuses on the extreme case that excludes all other cases and makes universal laws of nature understood in the new sense of overriding all formal and substantial differences. Such laws can arrive at universality by resting on the matter, not of this or that thing or being, but common to all differences and distinctions. The universal extreme case makes possible the critical experiment that decides the answer to a question from one instance of it. With it, science can be seen as falsifiable, as is said today, rather than merely probable and resting on an assertion capable of being explained by other causes that are not extreme. With one extreme example, Machiavelli shows a general and fundamental truth at the beginning of his discourses on Livy. He considers the extreme case of Romulus, founder of Rome, who had to kill his brother in order to be alone, as the founder. This single case shows the necessity of being alone, so as not to be opposed or distracted in founding, and the necessity of going so far as to take care of your brother in order to follow the first necessity. Romulus disposing of Remus typifies and excuses the kind of crime necessary at the beginnings of great accomplishments. As founder of the greatest political regime known so far, he is the critical case that establishes the universal truth. The materialism of modern science comes out of Machiavelli's disarming of human intent, robbing it of effect, as shown in his failure to refer to soul in his two major works, The Prince and the Discourses on Livy. The soul, shrouded and invisible, with all its problems of harmony and capability, is banished from science, together with intent as a non-material cause. Imagination will be needed, though disciplined, as one could see. With all these characteristics of modern science, Machiavelli can be recognized as supplying the fundamental basis, if not yet the mathematical expression, by which it creates its own forms apart from nature. Dealing with human beings, he could not study them in a laboratory. And wishing to deal directly with actual humans as they are, he did not conceive a formal state of nature like later liberals, designed like a laboratory to strip humans of convention and show them in pure nature. Instead, he used examples of extreme behavior, one of them of a tyrant in Perugia who failed to be altogether wicked when he had a choice opportunity, quote, to leave an eternal memory of himself. This is in Book 1, Chapter 27 of the Discourses. Machiavelli laments and corrects his failure, furnishing an example of pure nature out of his own brain. Machiavelli's often comical extremism, in this case, a bizarre solution for papal intrusiveness in politics, is his anticipation of the scientific laboratory, where he can experiment with the effect of shock. Instead of stripping human nature of convention in the state of nature, he shows how a prince can use conventional virtues by testing their resistance to being blatantly violated, thus submitting the ordinary, which is typical selfish behavior, to the discipline of the extraordinary or altogether wicked, which is unthinkably criminal. The necessity to act according to necessity makes necessity, as I said, both a compelling force of spontaneity and a standard for deliberate choice. This means that necessity is both descriptive and normative. For Machiavelli's realism draws values from facts rather than separating values from facts. The is of necessity leads to the ought of necessity. In fact, and note how this ever so familiar phrase is used, in fact, one has no choice. And if there seems to be a choice, one must choose as if one had no choice. Thus, Rome is praised for choosing imperialism over its neighbors rather than waiting, as did Sparta, for the particular necessity to acquire each neighbor that might arise piecemeal. But there is a complication. Ordinary human beings believe that moral choices are possible without regard to necessity. This is a delusion from which they cannot be saved. So a prince, or anyone imitating a prince, cannot simply announce that he does what is necessary. To do so would make him seem weak to his subjects, not in charge of events, but ruled by them. The prince must give the appearance of acting freely rather than following necessity. By appearing to choose, he can gain their admiration or fear of his virtue and their consent or submission to his rule. He can impress them as they hold him to be extraordinary or great. In so acting, he can get credit for free choice when in fact he is anticipating future necessities in his present choices. He can receive moral praise while violating morality, just as Machiavelli promised would have come to the failed tyrant of Perugia. Effectual truth, then, is not merely a statement of what happens to moral choices despite their moral intent, because of the resistance of chance to man's natural goodness. It is also a prescription of what can be achieved when one looks to control the chance one has perceived to be in the way of one's intent. One can anticipate how one's intent will be held by others and use this knowledge to conquer the chance that might prevent it. The fact reveals the value and gives it a compelling motive. Morality remains as what it was originally, the wishful imagination of ordinary people. They have a motive too, which is to believe that morality is possible, a position that they hold not accidentally, but of necessity, their necessity. Effectual truth does not seek to abolish morality. On the contrary, it needs morality. It needs something to shock in those not strong enough in mind or spirit to live without the assurance that one can afford to be moral. Realizing this, the prince, or anyone who can live without morality, discovers his own necessity to take advantage of those whose necessity makes them too weak to succeed. Necessity works to manage the necessity of the weak in order to obey the knowing prince's necessity. The knowing prince knows the art of war, enabling him to win over those who lack it. And if he lacks it, he will lose to the knowers. That's in chapter 14 of The Prince. The Socratic formula of virtue equals knowledge is vindicated by Machiavelli with a different knowledge and a correspondingly different virtue. One's necessity is one's own necessity, not another's. The other's necessity, whether that of weakness or of virtue, is in fact against yours. Necessity tells you that you must make others dependent and feel their dependence on you. To be independent is not to be isolated, living unnoticed, like the Epicurean philosopher. As a capable person, quote, a man notable for his quality, you will be noticed and suspected. You can then play crazy, fare il pazzo, like Brutus, but with the ultimate aim of making others play crazy to you. That's in Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 2. Necessity is a common principle that divides men from one another. For ultimately, it is always my necessity against yours. A common predicament may join us together for a while, but sooner or later, one of us, and thus both of us, will have to choose against the other. Necessity leads to one end, which is the tyranny of one alone, uno solo. This was what made Romulus kill his brother Remus, if with the pretext later dropped of wishing, quote, to help the common good and not himself. Necessity leads one to the tyranny of oneself. That is what is necessary. Tyranny is the effectual truth of the desire to control necessity through necessity. The greatest tyranny is an opinion, because it is above one's fatherland, above one's patria. Machiavelli said in a letter that he loved his patria more than his own soul. Would that be Italy or Florence? The answer is neither. In his impartial advice, he could sacrifice Florence to Italy, as in his exhortation at the end of The Prince, chapter 26, and give over Italy to a foreign invader, the King of France, whom he advises on how to succeed the next time, earlier in that work in chapter 3. His patria could be the sect or religion of a prophet, whose prophetic opinions may extend beyond the confines of a country or nation. But Machiavelli's ambition is to address all humanity, more precisely, the common good of each, bene comune di ciascuno, rather than any particular fatherland. Machiavelli himself is a tyrant because his notion of the necessity, which he was the first to see, has been imposed on all thinkers, and through them non-thinkers as well. His enterprise is the making of the modern world, which can be defined as a more or less concerted attempt at the rational control of chance for the advantage of mankind. That modernity, defined so broadly, could be the work of a single individual will be shocking to many today. We have become accustomed to the view that large impersonal forces, too powerful to be resisted and too grand to be the work of an individual, rule our lives in successive waves that we as societies or cultures can hardly predict, let alone control. Our lives seem to be under the very contrary of rational control, let alone that of a single individual. People today know the name of Machiavelli and the word Machiavellianism, an epithet for whatever they find dishonorable or disagreeable, despicable. Nonetheless, non di manco, a favorite Machiavellian counter to what one expects, there is reason to entertain the notion. For he had an example before him that should give pause to our skepticism about the power of an individual to convey a message to the world. Machiavelli, realist as he was, made a point of the greater power of arms over the influence of words, and he asserted insistently that all unarmed prophets are bound to fail. Still, readers of Machiavelli learn, or may be advised to learn, that when he becomes insistent on some point, one should be suspicious and question what he seems so sure of. Sure enough, it is very easy to think of a very obvious example of a successful unarmed prophet that was of supreme interest to him, Jesus Christ. This prophet is also an individual who changed the world and determined its course for centuries until today. What Machiavelli had before him was the thought, not that one individual would find it impossible to control the world, but that any such individual might learn how to accomplish that amazing feat from the example of the one individual who had already done it. Let this thought serve also as an initial response to the skepticism, quite understandable, that there could have been one person in charge of the beginning of modernity. What Machiavelli borrowed from the example before him was how to conquer, not with arms or open arms, as did Moses and Mohammed, but with concealed arms or fraud or propaganda. Specifically, fraud is always necessary, quote, is always necessary for those who wish to climb from small beginnings to sublime ranks, an allowance that includes himself. In his case, there was to be a philosophic revolution rather than conversion to revealed truth. But it was philosophy with a new profession, appealing to the young and the youthful in spirit, with a force and zeal similar to that of Christianity, but against it. This revolution took Christian revolution through conversion as its model, as well as its enemy. and it took heart from the belief that Christianity was now in its corrupted dotage, with its original spirit lost, and able to be opposed openly by someone with sufficient boldness. Machiavelli had the same belief as his contemporary Martin Luther, who undertook a reformation from within rather than a revolution from outside, and was another very powerful individual who made an age rather than being made by one. One does not need to attribute superhuman power to Machiavelli to see him as the founder and cause of a project based on the cose moderne that he claims long experience with. That Machiavelli had in view something so comprehensive and disputed as the modern world can be approached from the not unusual opinion that he stood for, even initiated, realism in chapter 15 of The Prince. Realism could be identified as doing what ensures worldly success. And Machiavelli claimed to have been concerned with worldly things from a, quote, long practice and continual reading. To establish this claim, he occupied himself with defining the world as the realm of necessities, and signified it by never referring to this world or the next world in The Prince and the Discourses, which are the only two works in which he says at their beginning that they contain everything he knows. The world had to be reclaimed from the distinction made by Christianity, so that this world becomes the world, the only world, and not subordinate to another world. He says that the ancient pagans, the Gentiles, esteemed the honor of the world, as the Christians do not, avoiding a perfect occasion on which to speak of this world as compared to the next. Of the two religions, the pagans do better to recognize the honor of the world than does, quote, our religion, which yet has, quote, shown the truth and the true way. This is in Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 2. With this advantage, namely having shown the truth and the true way, how could Christianity fail in so vital a respect as understanding the status of the world? In regard to the world, the pagans show the truth and the true way more than our religion, which, because it is ours, makes it necessary to say it is true. But actually, he doesn't say that it is true. It is possible to show the truth and the true way without being the truth and the true way. For one example already mentioned, Christianity shows the strength and perhaps also the means of winning consent through propaganda. The very church, composed of clerics, who Machiavelli asserts, quote, do not believe in the punishment of God, may well be the vehicle for bringing the relief of truth to the Christian belief in their truth. Machiavelli performed the work of realism that realists today shirk and leave to him of wresting realism from the ascendancy of theology. Necessity is under the necessity of concealing itself to some degree. Overall, and not only in chapter 15 of The Prince, Machiavelli makes it plain that not goodness, but necessity, meaning the necessity to do evil, is his principle. Is it now our principle? To call this realism is to admit that evil is more substantial, more real than good. One could make a list of instances of his evil advice. And in one chapter that I already noted, entitled, quote, very rarely do men know how to be altogether wicked or altogether good, he epitomizes his policy of partly revealing, partly concealing the necessity he recommends. From the title, one sees that men do not spontaneously know how to be altogether wicked or good. They know only part of the way and must be brought to go to the extreme. In the body of the chapter, one finds only one example, that of being altogether wicked, from which one may infer that, quote, altogether good is not possible or will not be taught. In that example, a certain tyrant, this is again book 1, chapter 27 of the Discourses, a certain tyrant who has been guilty of many crimes, nonetheless failed when he had a chance to kill the Pope and his attendants. If he had done so, quote, he would have done a thing whose greatness would have surpassed all infamy. Then would not this great deed have been an example of altogether good? Machiavelli does not say so, but he was himself in the company of the Pope and was an eyewitness to this notable but apparently exaggerated cowardly failure. He is the one who deserves the praise he would have bestowed upon the pathetic student who was unaware that he was in the presence of a teacher who could show him how to be altogether wicked. There in the example is in this example is the visible necessity of this tyrant and the invisible necessity unknown to the tyrant in the thought of Machiavelli. He does not reveal himself except to his better, more careful student readers. To them, he appears as the master conspirator in charge of the undertaking whose aim is to create the world in which his worldly advice will be taken. The philosopher is behind the prince tyrant, sharing his necessity, but also in charge of the world of necessity as a whole, with three parts: the people who remain moral, the tyrant who knows that morality brings ruin, and Machiavelli, who coordinates them and provides the new intended effectual truth. In our current phrase, he is leading from behind. The effectual truth of the morality that the people support is the tyranny that the princes manage. And its effectual truth is transformed by Machiavelli from unintended rivalrous consequences of maneuvers by contending tyrants to the plan of a revolutionary conspiracy. What great good would it do to kill one pope, one might ask? Machiavelli leaves it to his readers to discern what is really both altogether wicked and altogether good, and to find in his books the extent of his plan and the necessary means for it, which he calls new modes and orders. The plan or enterprise, impresa, of finding new modes and orders is dangerous for the reason that the envious nature of men makes them more ready to blame than to praise, even those who promise to work for the common good of everyone. To repeat, Machiavelli must both announce his enterprise and keep it secret, particularly his role as the prince over all of it. To fend off the suspicion of the visible princes he advises, he must keep himself invisible, giving them license to gain their glory and hold it entire, undiminished by his much greater glory. He flaunts his greater glory in declaring that, quote, I have decided to take a path as yet untrodden by anyone. And in the next sentence covers it over by conceding that if he is too weak himself, he will at least, quote, show the path to someone else with more virtue, as if virtue had nothing to do with showing the path of virtue. And in dealing with the people, he must both shock and respect their morality, based as it is on the false superiority of praise over blame. He must rattle their complacency and then restore it to show that he is no danger to him, rather to it, to the people's morality. He will act, quote, without any respect, senza alcun rispetto, yet show he is afraid. He will create Machiavellianism, but claim that he works for the common good. The necessity of his enterprise, in sum, is complicated in its execution by the two necessities of actual princes and ordinary people to distrust him. His extreme lack of respect for the existing order is matched by the delicacy, grace, and even propriety he practices in his rebellious insolence. His intent is dangerous, and his manners are superb. Despite the simplification of necessity over the good, by which it brushes aside all hesitation and deliberation, he is the only one that truly works according to necessity. The necessity of princes and peoples gives way to his. By substituting necessity for the good and effectual truth for the imaginary truth, Machiavelli has made a fundamental change in the relation of philosophy to politics. He knows that he cannot convince the common people that morality is ineffectual, that it is subject to human necessity, and that God will not come when one calls for him. He knows, too, that princes are, from the nature of their experience, much more willing to listen to him than are the people. The more apt pupils among them have at least partly wicked dispositions favorable to the tyrannical teaching. But they know little or nothing of science and are not philosophers. They are not capable of conceiving the premises of necessity, together with the new modes and orders one may infer from them and borrow from the techniques of Christianity. What then of succeeding philosophers who might carry the burden of Machiavelli's enterprise further toward its end? Being philosophers, they know that is, quote, it is good to reason about everything. That's Discourses 1, Book 1, Chapter 18. And will therefore think and act independently. Machiavelli needs to convince them to enlist in his game, in his army. This he managed to do, and the modern philosophy that came after Machiavelli fundamentally accepts his principle of effectual truth. Its truth relies on effects or facts. It denies that there is an intelligible nature composed of intelligible natures. Accordingly, it assimilates human nature to nature. Its laws of nature are universal laws of all nature. Its qualities can be presented as quantities. Its discoveries are made and verified from the extreme case rather than from what is normal. It reduces formal and final truth to efficient or effectual truth, which is also necessarily material. Its materialism is therefore idealistic as well as realistic. Modern philosophy is, to be sure, more friendly to mathematical science than Machiavelli could be. But to be so, it utilizes his premises and formalizes his examples in scientific method. Surveying the grand figures of modern philosophy, following Machiavelli, one must conclude, after taking the effort necessary to uncover his mostly hidden influence, that he was quite generally successful. His own fortuna shows the power of his thought and seems to vindicate his notion that fortune can be controlled. The effectual truth of what a teacher teaches may be found in what his students make of it, or whether and how they prosper with or against it. what do they actually take away from his takeaways, as we say? What are the typical errors they make? For example, transforming the good of Platonism into the God of Christianity. Machiavelli's effectual truth, however, was in the thought of his successors, not by chance, but because he put it there. Thank you. It's now necessary for me to stop.
Thank you very much. Professor Mansfield has agreed to take one or two questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. And I will begin by conveying one from Sean Irwin, who thanks Professor Mansfield and says, you opened by identifying Machiavelli as a philosophic founder and insisting on this. On your reading, what happens to the role of philosophy in the transition Machiavelli initiates and the new interpretations and concretions of the political he incites?
What happens to philosophy is that it changes its object from understanding to changing the world. There's a very explicit statement of this in Karl Marx's Theses on Feuerbach. And he said, up to now, it has been the business of philosophy to understand the world. Now it is time to change the world. So, and this changing results in or requires a move away from the notion that you find in Plato and Aristotle of nature as something intelligible, and therefore of the world as being fulfilled or perfected in an imagined intelligible world, a world of thought. No, the world of thought has to work with the world, which is the world of the senses. And I think that is the most, you say, most general thesis of modern philosophy. So I say all modern philosophy has been affected by Machiavelli, but not all of it follows him, and certainly not all of it obeys Machiavelli in any servile way. But we still are affected by Machiavelli as philosopher, even though we have lost our understanding of him or our perception of him as a philosopher.
If I can continue on this, how would you describe the effect on individuals as political agents, given the ascendancy of democracy?
As individual agents, we are affected by many later modifications or transformations of Machiavelli. But just to say, modern democracy seems to be based on a philosophy of rights, of natural rights. These natural rights are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was original in 18th century American formulation in the Declaration of Independence. But your right to life, seems to be the basis of your right to liberty, which is the basis of your life, of your right to the pursuit of happiness. The right to life is the right to self-preservation. And that means you are, the notion of self-preservation, you are adopting the principle of Machiavelli, that necessity requires you to put yourself first, and to put yourself understood as your sensible self, your actual self that is in the sensible, by which I mean the world of senses. So in that most general way, this is just one example of it, we follow Machiavelli.
Thank you very much. Let me convey one from Catherine Robiadek. Thank you, Professor Mansfield. You said that for Machiavelli, there is a consistent role for imagination. What is that role, especially after accepting la verità effettuale?
It is the role to understand what is possible once one accepts the virtual, rather the effectual truth. In the discourses and in the prints, there are 11 occurrences of the word imagine or imagination. And 10 of them understand it in a bad way. Your imagination misleads you. But there is just one instance of imagination used in a good way. It helps you understand. And that is in the Discourses, Book 3, chapters 39, which is the only chapter in either of the books that refers to science. It refers to science twice. Ferma scienza. And you get a ferma scienza by using your imagination. For example, imagining that the act of hunting is an act of war. So you can imagine, say, that an act of war might be a war in a spiritual sense, the way in which Christianity understands war, or a war to convert, a war to bring the word to the world. And that's a spiritual war, a war of ideas. So that requires the imagination. The world of ideas is, in Machiavelli's sense, however, not a spiritual war, but an actual war that requires a spiritual transformation, one from God to man, and from God's world to man's world.
Thank you. I have a couple more in the Q&A, and then I'm going to let Professor Sullivan ask her question at the end. So the next one is from Renaud-Philippe Carnet. I wonder how much difference there is between Machiavelli and his predecessors. To be quick, Aristotle speaks about prudence in terms of action and achieving one's aims. If a prudent man can only be one who succeeds, just how different are they? Is the greatest difference not about virtue in terms of action and achievement, but about the ends to be achieved?
Yes, that's a very good point. I think that Machiavelli doesn't depart from the orders of others entirely. So he has a prudence, but he has a grande prudenza, a great prudence, which is an inflated prudence. So whereas Aristotle said prudence is in the world of practice and not in the world of theory, in Machiavelli, prudence moves into the world of theory. So what is prudent to do in the world becomes what can be understood or must be understood in the intellectual world, which is now the world of necessity, rather than the world of intelligibility. I'm speaking generalities now, but that would be, so whereas for Aristotle, prudence is tied to moral virtue. His discussion of prudence is in book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and that comes after the list of moral virtues. You could say that prudence leads into or introduces the intellectual virtue, but it isn't the same thing. I think in Machiavelli, prudence is an intellectual virtue and not just a moral virtue.
Thank you. The next one is from Alberto Ghibellini. Is Christianity's influence on Machiavelli only limited to the idea of propaganda, in your view?
No. It is also, there are institutions of Christianity. For example, the notion of sacrifice. In our liberal theory today, a citizen is obliged to obey the government because the citizen gets benefits from the government. But Machiavelli borrows from Christianity the notion that one doesn't simply obey God, but sacrifices to him. So he takes from religion, and especially Christian religion, because he's interested in the particular example of the great Christian sacrifice, that a prince should get his subjects to sacrifice for him. It's not that he brings benefits to them, which then they are likely to become ungrateful for once they become routine. But that he gets them to sacrifice on his behalf. So that would be notion that he's borrowed from Christianity that goes beyond. Then also an election, a democratic election for Machiavelli, an election is a way of punishing the prince. When the people hold the prince or the government accountable for its actions in an election, what they are really doing is either punishing him or failing to punish him. So either he will win the election, in which case he will have escaped punishment, or he will not be reelected, like Donald Trump, and suffer. So that an election is not so much a positive choice as putting the government under a threat. This is his way of understanding things that I think are institutions. You could also find a Machiavellian source for our notion of separation of powers. And indeed for the whole idea, that you find especially in the American Constitution, of a kind of competition in government, within government, among the ambitious. So you could go much further than the notion of propaganda.
Thank you. The penultimate one is from Beatrice Magni. Do you think that Machiavelli had a conception of the truth in a certain sense that might even be metaphysical? Because she says, I don't think that we can think of any kind of effectual truth without such a metaphysical conception.
Yes, another good question. I think she's right about that. So I don't think that for Machiavelli, it's possible, or I don't think it's possible, to have effectual truth as the only truth. In a way, a metaphysical or even non-metaphysical truth remains, because you have to judge the effect. And over time, you have to see whether an action taken to control something actually succeeded in controlling it. And that is, in one sense, it's effectual truth, but then whether the effectual truth was good for us. So we have to know what is good for us. And that you can say is metaphysical, or at least not effectual. In other words, it's good not to be good. That's Machiavelli's message. And the question we have to ask is it really?
Thank you very much. I'll recede into the background and let Professor Sullivan ask the final question.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Mansfield. It was a masterful presentation that is obviously the product of deep reflection, and it also requires deep reflection from your audience. And I have a question in that you refer to the tyrant or Machiavelli as a tyrant, and I'm wondering whether you could elaborate on how he might differ at all from prior tyrants, including the Christian God. I am thinking particularly of his concern with free will in Prince 25, where he says something like, so that our free will not be eliminated, I judge. So there he's somehow suggesting that his free will depends on his own judging. So as a tyrant, would you say that Machiavelli has more concern for human freedom?
He has at least concern for a human necessity, which is different from the necessities of non-humans. We humans are capable of morality, and morality is a kind of resistance to necessity. If you do the moral thing, that means, at least in the tough cases, you do what is not necessary for you to do, and what it might be costly to you. So that's a kind of human resistance to the laws of necessity as they might apply everywhere. You could say that our modern science forgets that human beings can resist modern science, dislike it, or try to change it, like in the movement about that we see today against climate change. So for Machiavelli, that is a complication within necessity. He realizes, I think he realizes that people will resist modern science in a way that I think we've pretty much forgotten today. And so his understanding of, you can say, of the principle of modern science is better than ours. There has to be a certain remainder of chance in human life for our freedom to exist. And so it's not necessary that we follow necessity. So you have to be intelligent to do that, and therefore you have to be free to exercise your intelligence. So not every, it isn't that necessity, Machiavelli's notion of necessity allows you to predict with exactness everything that will happen, because people might resist the truth, the scientific truth, which he gives to them. But it's probable over the long haul that those who listen to Machiavelli will prevail over those who do not. And so that would be his justification of a necessity which may not appear as necessary, and which cannot appear as necessary in order to do its work. Because you won't work hard, you won't be virtuous unless you're not sure that a good result will follow without your virtue.
All right, well, thank you very much. And I think that concludes our presentation for today. And I want to thank both Professors Mansfield and Sasso for their decades of outstanding scholarship and the education that they provided all of us for Machiavelli. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, and I protest against promoting me to an equality with Gennaro Sasso.
Thank you, Professor Mansfield. We're very grateful. I just wanted to remind everyone who's attending that we will be hosting another talk on May 12th. If you have not received the announcement and would like to, please send an email message to Sean Irwin at Irwin, ERWIN, at Barry, BARRY.edu. Sean will add you to the mailing list, and we will keep you posted about future events as well. Warm thanks to everybody for attending, and we will see you soon.